We're only on episode 21, but there's a good argument to be made that Fighting Street is the most important PC Engine game. Not for the game itself, it's a weak port of a game that wasn't very good to begin with, but rather because of the format. Fighting Street is the first CD-ROM game. Okay, it's tied with Noriko, which released on the same day, but people don't bother with Noriko. And a momentous occasion like this requires a lot of backstory. To keep things simple, there were two primary methods of distributing software. Computers relied on magnetic media, floppy disks, cassette tapes. This type of media was cheap to reproduce, and had the advantage that you could write to it multiple times. It also had a relatively large capacity, while you could have hundreds of kilobytes of data. And for those who need context, hundreds of kilobytes would be about 1/3 of one frame of this video. A major disadvantage of magnetic media was that it was fragile. There were a lot of normal, everyday things that could destroy it. You could package it in a way to help protect it a bit, but not completely protect it. The other major downside is that magnetic media was trivial to copy. Any 12-year-old who could get their hands on a second cassette deck could make a copy of that program. Magnetic media wound up making an excellent choice for computers, but not so good for a mass audience. The other option was ROMs. Read-only memory, a huge number of transistors laid out in such a way that giving the chip a number would give back an associated number. ROM chips would effectively last forever unless you took a hammer to them, and since you had to have special manufacturing facilities to create them, they were really hard to duplicate. The biggest downside was the expense. Costs went up exponentially as you increased the size of the ROM, and the ones that were in the price range appropriate for consumer technology did not hold a whole lot. Dozens of kilobytes. But what if there was a way to dramatically increase the amount of storage, but also not be excessively expensive? Enter the CD-ROM. CDs became available to consumers in 1985, and they worked optically. A laser shining on the disc focused so tightly that it could read microscopic divots, and these corresponded to the zeros and ones that a computer required. Spin the disc past the laser, and it read the patterns in a spiral going outward. Thanks to having fine control over the position of the laser, it was simple to jump to any point on the disc. The CD-ROM standard initially described two varieties of data. The red book described how digital audio was written to the disks, and the yellow book described how computer data was written to the disk. A disk completely given over to data could hold more than 700 megabytes, hundreds of times more than you could hold on commercially available magnetic media. The CD-ROM was also relatively cheap to manufacture, and by the 90s those manufacturing costs would be down to pennies per disk. The CD-ROM would be the perfect format for software distribution. But not quite yet. In the 80s, the prices had yet to come down on the technology. In particular, the laser diodes weren't especially cheap to manufacture. So software uses would be small for a while still. Mainly restricted to things where you'd need to store a large amount of data. I remember the first bit of CD-ROM software I encountered was a card catalog. And you better believe those school librarians wouldn't let the kids anywhere near that machine. CD-ROM games would start trickling out on computers in '89, but the first people to get there were NEC and Hudson with the PC Engine. The PC Engine had been designed with expandability in mind. They wanted people to buy additional modules, add a modem to the hardware, a drawing tablet, a printer. In the late 80s, they were showing off all sorts of potential applications for the PC Engine. The only one of these that came to fruition and got any traction was the CD-ROM drive. While Hudson developed the PC Engine themselves, it was NEC who developed the CD-ROM, which might be why NEC put so much effort into supporting it. The CD-ROM, as the platform was officially called, debuted on store shelves December 4th, 1988. And it was a bit of a confusing launch. To get the system cost 59,800 yen. But the platform was released at a very bad time, because January 1st, 1989, a new consumption tax went into effect. And as part of that, CD-ROM hardware would be taxed at a very high rate. So what NEC did was split the CD-ROM in half. You can purchase the CD-ROM drive for a mere 32,800 yen, and that's the amount that would get the extra tax. But you couldn't do anything with just the CD-ROM drive. You also had to purchase the interface unit that connected the CD-ROM to the PC Engine. That cost 27,000 yen, but carried a much lower tax burden. As the Japanese economy started getting shaky throughout 1989, the Diet walked back that extra consumption tax, and a year later NEC would bundle the CD-ROM drive and interface unit together. They even gave it a discount price, just 57,300 yen. While CD-ROM games got off to a slow start, they eventually became the primary selling point of the PC Engine. There's a crossover point around 1992 where HuCards stop selling and CD-ROM keeps growing. So the first half of the PC Engine library is almost all HuCards, while the second half is almost all CD-ROM. The CD-ROM would go on to be one of the more confusing aspects of the PC Engine, because there would be an explosion of hardware models and modifications that would guarantee confusion. When the hardware was redesigned as the Core Graphics 2, it no longer fit into the interface unit, and so a whole different drive had to be released. But there are versions of the PC Engine that can't fit any CD-ROM drive. NEC would eventually want to expand the capabilities of the CD-ROM, and so created what was called the Super CD-ROM format. For the classic PC Engine hardware, this meant swapping out the CD controller HuCard for a Super CD HuCard. The Super CD-ROM spec was implemented in some versions of the PC Engine hardware, like the Turbo Duo models, which merged the PC Engine with the CD-ROM into one unit. And finally, to expand things even further, the American branch of NEC developed an expansion card, and that was released as the Arcade CD-ROM. Of course, because the Super CD-ROM units and the regular CD-ROM units weren't compatible, they each had to have their own Arcade CD-ROM HuCard. I could even take this another layer deeper, but that's better reserved for when I get to that funky hardware. Basically, NEC made it as difficult as possible to know what you needed to play any given game. And yet, somehow despite this, the CD-ROM proved to be a fairly big success. Roughly half of all PC Engines sold had some kind of CD-ROM, and it gained a lot of traction in the early 90s as the place to make your multimedia projects. It wasn't enough to keep the PC Engine on top, but it was enough to keep it in the position of plucky upstart until technology started outpacing the whole platform. And before I get any further, I just want to express my displeasure at the name CD-ROM. That's the pronunciation used in the original commercials, so it's not like something fans came up with afterward. It seems to be based on the idea that it's ROM squared, but you have to obey PEMDAS. That would make it CD-ROM with two M's, not CD-ROM. Okay, I had to get that off my chest, and that's the only time I'm going to bring it up in this entire series. It's time to finally get to the game of the hour, Fighting Street. Even if this port didn't hold the lofty position of the first CD-ROM game, it's still an important game. While there had been plenty of one-on-one fighting games at this point, the direct inspiration here came from designer Takashi Nishiyama's previous work, Spartan X, or Kung Fu as it was known internationally. Wanting to take Spartan X's boss battles further, Nishiyama developed the arcade game Street Fighter, a game that's known for precisely two things: its title, and the pneumatic buttons that they included on some early versions of the machine, where how hard you hit them determined the strength of the blow in the game. Capcom dropped those rather quickly when they learned the exact same lesson that everyone else did when they made an arcade machine that asked players to punch it. Things get broken fast when you do that, and not necessarily the machine. For home ports, Namco somehow beat Capcom to the punch and trademarked Street Fighter. Rather than spend time sorting it out or paying Namco off, Capcom's solution was to flip the words around. Namco never published their own Street Fighter game, so they just remain a weird footnote in the story. Fighting Street is all about Ryu, a martial artist that's traveling the world. Warriors from around the globe face off against him in matches that are decided by 2 out of 3 falls. Ryu and his opponents both have a health bar, and of course your goal is to beat it out of them. Button 1 punches, button 2 kicks. The strength of the attack is determined by how long you hold the button down for. A quick tap and it's a light attack. Hold it for half a second and you're doing a heavy attack. Of all the things wrong with Fighting Street, that interface isn't one of them. It's pretty easy to get the rhythm down, and there's some timing in doing those heavy hits, but Fighting Street isn't technical enough for that to make a big difference. When you start the game, you're given your choice of 4 countries as Ryu's initial destination. Each country has 2 opponents to defeat, and where you start determines the order you progress through the whole game. After you clear those 4 initial countries, you're off to Thailand to face the final 2 opponents. Something that you're quickly going to notice here is that there aren't many frames of animation, and what little you have is pretty slow and jerky. You're so unresponsive that it's really impossible to do combos, and your opponents are often pretty asymmetrical. Fighting Street was designed as an arcade game to drain quarters from pockets, not provide a competitive scene. And most of your foes have huge sweeping attacks, which they use constantly with no space to breathe. While you can press back to block, a new innovation for fighting games here, blocking only covers a small area, and a lot of those big attacks will just go right through it. The other major innovation of Fighting Street are special moves. If you move the controller in a quarter stick motion from down to forward and press punch, Ryu throws a fireball. Do that same quarter circle backwards and press kick, and he does a spinning kick in the air. And of course, start from forward and then go down and down forward, ending with a punch, and you do his dragon punch. But a problem in Fighting Street is that these moves are almost impossible to pull off in the game. The timing is not normal. The only special moves I pulled off properly were 2 hurricane kicks. Now, there is a cheat mode. If you can get a high score and enter your name on the scoreboard as .SD, then at the title screen hit left select 1 and 2 at the same time, you get a stage select, a larger number of credits, and you perform special moves by pointing in a direction and hitting select. Assuming you can pull off the special move because enemies just rush you down and beat you to death in seconds. Yeah, your opponents in Fighting Street are incredibly unfair. I managed to defeat 4 of them by just giving up on strategy and resorting to button mashing, but it's still a brutally unfair and difficult game that essentially requires that you exploit gaps in the AI in order to make any progress. They are on you in an instant when you start a round, and in some cases, once you're caught by them, it's already over. If you defeat all the opponents in a country, you go to a bonus stage where you need to break an item. The power bar will rapidly drop and you have to strike with full force in order to win, but when it goes back up, the power bar goes to a random point in the top quarter of that bar. So even if you have perfect timing, you have to get lucky. Of course, this game didn't get a lot of interest based on the single-player mode. It was the multiplayer versus mode that really drew people in. There are no selectable characters here. Whoever is player 2 becomes Ken, Ryu's buddy, and a guy who has all of the exact same moves. Now you might be asking yourself, what does this game get from being on CD? Well, first, there's absurdly long load times. That's going to be a consistent thing with these CD games. Load times per stage are over 30 seconds. And annoyingly, if you defeat an opponent, it loads the next stage in before you see the victory screen. That's great for getting to the next level, but also means delayed gratification for your win and staring at a black screen for a long time. What they really use the CD for with Fighting Street is the music. The music seems to have been directly captured from arcade hardware, and there's a bit more than 2 minutes of audio for every opponent. If you were to take Fighting Street and put it into your music CD player, You first get a track warning you that it is not an audio CD.
これは HE システムの CD-ROM ディスクです。2曲目にコンピューター用データが入っていますので、再生しないでください。
Then the data track, which just sounds like noise. And then 22 tracks of arcade music. This is going to be the most common use of the CD-ROM format for the time being. There are some very large and very extensive voice samples, but these have all been digitized and are in the data region. They also sound like they've been recorded by a programmer in the company bathroom using a tin can as a microphone.
You've got a lot to run before you beat me. Try again, kid.
There's only one victory message and one loss message, so it's the same lines for everyone. When you get beaten up, you have 10 seconds to continue, but unless you've used a cheat code, you only have 3 credits when you start the game, so that means 2 continues. As for your opponents, well, if you start in Japan, there's Retsu. He might be the easiest opponent in the game. I beat him on my first try and I was completely out of practice. Geki is a ninja who can teleport and throw shuriken. He can throw them high, low, or while jumping, which makes blocking them harder than you might expect. Over in America, your first opponent is Joe, a big guy who favors jump kicking. Then in front of Mount Rushmore, you fight a boxer named Mike, let's say Bison. Yeah, Bison. No one will figure out that reference. He only punches, but he hits really hard. In the UK, you first fight Birdie, a guy with a mohawk who likes to headbutt you a lot. And then, out in the countryside, you have to face Eagle, a dapper man with a set of tonfas that he can swirl around. Atop the Great Wall of China, you fight Lee, who has a dashing hop punch. And then in a Chinese marketplace, you face Gen, who has some devastating jump kicks. If you manage to reach Thailand, then you're going to face Adon, a kickboxer whose hopping kick will cut right through you. And finally, Sagat, a giant man whose most notable feature is his beautiful, unscarred chest. While the arcade version wasn't a huge success, it did have enough positive feelings around it that eventually follow-ups were made. And those follow-ups got ported to the PC Engine very late in its life. And appropriately enough, one of these follow-ups was used to launch the arcade CD-ROM. You won't find many fans of Fighting Street in Japan. It's definitely one of those games that got eclipsed by what came after it. I remember when I played this version for the first time shortly after the sequel, my reaction was, this is it? Well, I never need to play this again. And yet, here I am. Fighting Street for the PC Engine CD-ROM is not a very good port of a not very good game. It has the distinction of being the only console port of Fighting Street, but nobody was really clamoring for another version of that. It comes to historical significance 2 different ways. It's just neither of those are a consequence of being any good.